Okay, so take two now. This is Miguel Toribio Mateas, and today's session is on the clinical applications of NADH as well as other molecules. And we're going to be focusing on practice-based evidence, so on cases that allow you to build your clinical practice acquired evidence. So I am presenting this talk today, kindly sponsored by Vitae Natural Nutrition, and I'll be mentioning them and thanking them at the end of the presentation. But today's presentation is about acquiring clinical skills and discussing cases. So if you've seen my previous webinar that I did a couple of months ago, it will integrate some of that information, but from a practical point of view. So apologies to those who didn't have sound on the presentation. I believe it's something to do with your local computer on how it's interpreting the sound coming from Join Me. So I'll be sharing with you the link to the presentation later. So I'm just going to scroll to the next slide and basically introduce myself. I know that you know me already, but for those of you who don't or who may hear me for the first time, just a little bit about me. My background is in nutritional therapy for a little while now, specializing in aging and conditions of the aging. Particularly in the last couple of years, I've been working in applied neuroscience or clinical neuroscience. So I'm just finishing my master's at Roehampton University, working on neural stem cells and the application of some of the nutrients that we're discussing today on cell fate or apoptosis, mitochondrial function, and DNA replication. So I'll be popping some information to do with the brain as we go along. But focusing on the cases as well. So if you want to know anything more about me, we can do that at the end, or you can always send me an email or contact me on social media and so on. So today's session is about exploring the use of some of these molecules that we've seen before, but from a practical point of view, so by illustrating them with cases. And I've prepared a couple of cases that work really well with these kind of molecules that we're discussing today. And I've illustrated these cases. And again, if you've seen me talk before, I've got this meter for how difficult the papers that I use to illustrate my cases are to understand. I've actually got a grade from 1 to 5. 1 is absolutely non-geek, can be read by the general public and understood completely. It goes on to 5, which is a degree of complexity that requires very specialist knowledge of the subject. So anything 2 and 3 is kind of easy. It's kind of a practitioner grade from 3 and 4, but you can still share with your clients if you wanted a 2 and a 3. Anything 4 and 5 may be a little trickier. So just to get an idea of the kind of things that I'm going to be sharing with you. So I'm going to talk about evidence-based medicine and practice-based medicine. So what is evidence-based medicine and practice-based medicine? Evidence-based medicine, everybody talks about evidence-based medicine as the way to practice any healthcare discipline. It's about abiding by the most relevant scientific evidence, and there is a ranking for that. We're going to see in a second. In fact, I can show you now, whereby we see systematic reviews of certain subjects at the top of this, what is called the evidence-based pyramid of knowledge and scientific information. We also see randomized controlled trials as part of this pyramid. We see critically appraised topics or evidence-based synthesis and guidelines, as well as critically appraised individual articles or article synopsis. So that's kind of the pyramid of evidence-based medicine that we refer to on a regular basis. But what I wanted to touch upon is the fact that already in 1996, 1997, Professor Sackett of the NHS Research and Development Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University talked about using clinical judgment and taking into account patients' values and preferences when providing advice as part of an intervention. So what certain individuals who talk about evidence all the time focus on is really just this circle in here is a third of what evidence-based medicine is about, is the relevant scientific evidence, which is what we see on the pyramid that I'm showing you now. So they're basically focusing on the relevance of the evidence, on the appropriateness of the evidence, and only going by things like you cannot recommend this nutrient or this intervention because there isn't enough evidence. There isn't a randomized controlled trial or a systematic review that actually supports the use of that specific intervention. Where Professor Sackett actually wrote a very good review that I'll be sharing with you after the presentation as well. So I've created a folder with a few of the papers that I'm sharing with you today, and I'll send you a link so you can download them. And he said that without clinical expertise, practice risks become tyrannized by evidence, for even excellent external evidence may be inapplicable or inappropriate for an individual patient. So as you know, anybody dealing with an individual, and many of you today are nutritional therapists, so we deal with individuality. We need to take our clients' values and preferences into account, and we need to use our clinical judgment. So based on the fact that we're actually going by what is relevant to us in terms of scientific evidence, we're using our clinical judgment and we're taking into account individuality. I believe very much we're using evidence-based medicine, but what is more important is that we're actually using a practice-based evidence. We're actually learning as we practice, which is what we're focusing on today. So without clinical judgment and without patients taking into account our patients' values and preferences, we're really not practicing evidence-based medicine at all. That's what I wanted to kind of like start by saying as an introduction. We have some tools that allow us to practice that evidence-based medicine or nutrition. In our case, if you're a member of BAND, you have access to the nutritional medicine database that gives you access to papers and monologues and so on different substances. And we also use, or I hope that you're using PubMed on a regular basis to find your papers to support your arguments. But again, always taking into account that you do need to apply the knowledge and experience that you acquire in practice and balance that with the best available clinical evidence from research. If you prioritize one or another, you're not actually going to be providing your client with that best experience that they're expecting from you as a practice-based evidence clinician. So most important tool for all practitioners, I would say, is critical thinking, because without any critical thinking, we're not going to be able to recognize these assumptions that are made by science, because when you're testing a hypothesis, you're actually dealing with assumptions. You're assuming that certain conditions are met. You should be able to evaluate these arguments. So when you read a paper, just not take it for granted. Actually see, does this work for me in practice or does it not? Or is it confirmed with by what I'm actually experiencing on a one-to-one basis with my clients? And can you draw your own conclusions? This is the most important part of it all. So most importantly as well, lately, this is from a very interesting paper that I was reading the other day, on the basis that I do a lot of social media stuff. I'm sure that you're also doing social media on Facebook, Twitter, and actually finding that your clients read these things that you're writing, and they read things that other opinion leaders are actually writing on the internet as well, in blogs. again, social media like Twitter and so on. Also listening to the TV and the radio, and watching TV and radio, and coming back to you and saying, I've listened to Jamie Oliver talking about sugar, or I've watched the sugar film, or I've read your tweets about energy and vitalities. What do they mean to you? So you need to apply your ability to evaluate this information that may not meet the strict criteria that are needed in that pyramid of evidence-based medicine that I showed you before, which is a scientific evidence, which is all about validation and systematic reviews, validity of the data, replicability in randomized controlled trials, and so on. And that you should be able to actually bridge that scientific evidence with the knowledge that is more translatable to people, and apply that translation to your individual clinical practice, which is what we're going to be seeing today. So let's go with the first case and go with Gabrielle, who is a sufferer of fibromyalgia. Is somebody who I've known for quite some time. She dips in and out of my practice. She's coming to me practically from the beginning that I graduated, but she tends to do well and then disappear and then come back, like you will experience many of your clients will do. So the salient points of her case is that she's late 30s. She was diagnosed with chronic fatigue when she was in her late teens. She was then diagnosed with, she recovered from chronic fatigue, but was diagnosed with fibromyalgia in her early 20s. She manages pain mainly through diet, so she actually needed to lose weight, and she did that with me, and she's been maintaining. She puts on a little bit every now and then. She goes back on low carbohydrate, higher protein, which was quite novel for her. She hadn't thought about that before. You see all sorts of people with different degrees of knowledge about diet and so on. The culprit in here, which I wanted to focus on, is the fact that a few months back, she was feeling quite lethargic. She had to go to the GP for routine tests for her fibromyalgia, and she was told that she was folic acid deficient and that she needed to take some folic acid, which she was given on prescription. So she was actually taking just synthetic folic acid. Just around the same time, she reports starting to feel slightly low in energy and not being able to think clearly. She didn't put this in here, but she's a civil servant. She has a fairly active job. She only works part-time 3 days a week, but when she's at work, she needs to be really on the ball. So foggy thinking is not an option, really. She needs to be really clear in her brain as to what she's doing and so on. Like we all want, but you know, if you need to support an MP, probably it's a little bit more important that your thinking is really clear. So she's a busy lady. She's committed to change, but she doesn't want to go completely overboard and cook everything from scratch. She's happy to take some supplements, but prefers not to have lots of bottles going. So minimal supplements will be better. And she likes to check what goes on inside. That's kind of translating her own or transcribing her own words. So she likes to test. Again, not excessively and not a lot of money in testing, but every now and then she will want to run a few background tests just to see what's going on. So now there is something in here that clicked when I was talking to her about folic acid and metabolized folic acid, which I've brought about, I've talked about in previous webinars that I've done this year, and the fact that synthetic folic acid has the ability to form what is called unmetabolized folic acid in serum, and this is a really good paper to learn about unmetabolized folic acid, and I'm going to be showing you what unmetabolized folic acid is and how it comes about. So this is another slide that you may be familiar with because I've shown it before. And I'm not going to go into the whole of the detail of the pathway of folic acid metabolism, but just to remind you that folic acid, the bioactive form of folic acid is methylated folic acid as a 5-MTHF or L-methylfolate. And that is the end product of folic acid metabolism, which can start by synthetic folic acid supplementation or dietary folates. And there are quite a few different steps that can actually pose a problem in how that initial substrate, be it folic acid, synthetic folic acid, or dietary folate, is actually metabolized into methylated folic acid. You can download this infographic. I've actually put a link in there that you'll be able to click on when you receive the presentation later. So, as I said, I don't want to really dwell on this right now, just for you to understand that there are several steps that can actually, let's say, go wrong in folic acid metabolism. And for somebody who has got issues with energy going on for a long time, providing folic acid as synthetic folic acid is potentially not the best idea. So let's just go with that for now. So this is Gabrielle's blood work. We checked a number of different markers, but amongst them, we checked some active B12 and red cell folate, which I do with the doctor's laboratory. So I'm going to show you some tests today. This is just plain hematology. Even some GPs will do it because the doctor's laboratory actually works with GPs. They outsource some of their services. So some surgeries will actually do RBCs, so red blood cell folate and B12, as well as other nutrients. And there's a reading of homocysteine as well, which if you're familiar with different labs, you'll know that Genova, for example, tells you that over 10.40 micromoles liter, it's actually suboptimal. The more mainstream readings and levels are less than 15. So because TDL, the doctor's laboratory, is actually a very mainstream pathology lab, is going with the mainstream readings, which are less than 15. So, but let's say that she's not ideal in homocysteine. And we also see that there's a marker of generalized oxidation and glycation, which is the glycated hemoglobin, which is right borderline onto pre-diabetic. And that's a reading for management of blood sugar and oxidation of sugar molecules with proteins, glycation. So that's just to have a little idea. Sorry for the typo in there. I've just seen two eyes in there. So what is unmetabolized unmetabolized folic acid, and why is it a problem? Folic acid is metabolized in the gut and the liver, and synthetic folic acid has got the ability to saturate the receptors in cells in the gut lumen that allow for that conversion from synthetic folic acid to 5-MTHF, which again happens in different steps from the gut lumen to the liver. So when you've got an influx of synthetic folic acid going into the gut, it can actually saturate those receptors, blocking the absorption of dietary folate and blocking the conversion from synthetic folic acid to 5-MTHF. So this is one of the reasons why synthetic folic acid is not really a good idea. So if you've got anybody on synthetic folic acid, it may be an idea to move them on to L-methylfolate or an equivalent. So And there's another thing as well. Folic acid in cases of B12 deficiency, as we've seen that that's the case of Gabrielle. She's actually just below the recommended levels of 25.1 picomoles per liter. So in her case, supplementing with folic acid can actually exacerbate B12 deficiency. So there seems to be a relationship between unmetabolized folic acid and B12 levels, and the higher the unmetabolized folic acid, the lower the B12. So if you are taking these two papers into account, basically putting the context together, you've got a situation where you're providing synthetic folic acid. The person is actually deficient in B12, so you should really be addressing that before anything else, but you haven't. So basically, the GP has given her this folic acid. Fair enough, she was deficient, so she's getting folic acid. But what is not taken into account is the fact that this the presence of folic acid is saturating receptors in the gut and impeding the conversion to methylated folic acid, to the bioactive compound that she will be using. And not only that, but she will also be experiencing an exacerbation in B12 deficiency. So what do we do with Gabrielle? So the basic intervention recommended, and these are salient points, so a few other bits and pieces, but the main things are increased dietary sources of vitamin B12 and normally iron as well. So 200 grams of chicken livers at least 3 times. I know she was keen anyway, so it wasn't a problem. It may not be an option for everybody, but then again, there is always supplements. So the rest is pretty much the same, which was a low-carb, high-protein diet. In fact, a pretty good diet. She's in general quite compliant with diet measures. And even though she hadn't come to see me in a while, she was still pretty much doing the same as we talked about, which was very much along the lines of the banned well-being guidelines for beating the bloat. So the higher protein, low carbohydrate, lower grains, not completely gluten-free, but mindful of gluten and so on. So quite high in greens anyway. And in terms of the daily supplements, I recommended stopping folic acid supplements immediately. And I didn't want to supplement with any other folic acid until we knew that her B12 had actually recovered. And at that point, then do another burst of L-methylfolate. So the initial recommendation was to have some NADH in a compound called Reconnect that has got NADH, coenzyme Q10, serine, and vitamin C. I also recommended 5,000 micrograms of B12 sublingual spray for 2 weeks, and that was a product called Shot of B12 that is available quite easily on the internet and Natural Dispensary and so on. And then, because I don't like working with heavy dosages for a long time, then that was reduced to twice weekly for another week, for 2 weeks, sorry. So that's the kind of a basic protocol. And this is what I wanted to show you. So this is before and after. This is after 5 weeks. And we've got vitamin B12, just not ideal. Again, I would like to see just a little bit more than 165. In here is at 202, but not massive. Oh, hang on a second. Just red cell folate still low, but has improved slightly. Homocysteine has improved slightly, very, very slightly. Hemoglobin A1C has improved very, very slightly. So we've got an improvement in markers mainly the vitamin B12. So what we have seen is an improvement in B12 and folate levels without actually doing anything about folate, and I'll explain why in a second. We assume, and this is untested, an improvement or reduction in unmetabolized folic acid levels. We've seen also a reduction in glycation, which is a marker of oxidative state, and we've seen an improvement in homocysteine levels. So she also reports that she is feeling better energy from about 3 days after starting the program, and less foggy thinking, which is, again, it's not a miracle. So she is not completely resolved, and she's phoned me to say that she's completely cured of everything and she can think 24 hours a day without any problems, but she's saying that she's actually more able to focus, which is good. So what we have done, basically, we have taken the patient's values into account. We have taken our clinical judgment into account. So we have really turned evidence-based medicine into practice-based evidence. We have actually integrated the two. We've integrated the basic scientific knowledge that justifies our actions, our clinical decisions, but we have actually made choices that are applicable to our patient, to our client, and we've used our clinical judgment as well. So in this case, we've actually done something that may go against what the GP may have said, but it's justified. It's kind of like a safe action as well. It's a clinical measure that is justified and has actually caused the desired effect. So that's good. So any questions so far? No questions? Okay. And I will rewind just briefly on here just to say that really the moral of the story, if you would be always check your folic acid and B12 levels if you can, and not just on serum, which is normally what you would get as the kind of cheap and cheerful, but if you can, on red blood cells. The reason being that on red blood cells, you also get a span of validity for those readings, which is equal to the life of the red blood cells for that person, which in average is likely to be about 90 days. So when you get a reading for somebody based on red blood cell, which is normally called active, so active folate or active B12, it's a reading that's valid for B12. So this Hilda, so your question is why would like them? I'm not sure I understand why would like extra them ref of active B12. Could you rephrase that, please? I'm not sure I get what you mean. There's a question from Hilda Solomons that I'm not sure I understand. Okay, so the thinking behind supplementing with NADH is the fact that, in fact, let me just rewind here again. All of these enzymes that you see on the folic acid metabolism cycle are actually reductases. So we know about the MTHFR because it's a trendy enzyme. Again, I've covered it in more detail in other sessions. I'm not sure whether you've attended them or not, but that is only just the bottleneck at the bottom, and depending on your SNPs, on your single nucleotide polymorphisms, you can have anything from normal activity of the enzyme to about 70% reduced enzyme activity. That depends mainly on two polymorphisms, on the genes, on that MTHFR gene, on location C667T and A1298C. So there's a lot of science on the C667T, which is taken as the gold standard. And people talk about it a lot in terms of like chronic fatigue and cardiovascular disease, autism, all sorts of conditions associated with that. And then there's a little bit less science, but still good science on the A1298C. That's only just one of the enzymes, even though it's an important enzyme at the bottom of this pathway. But all of the other enzymes, C1-THF and DHRFR, dehydrofolate reductase and C1 tetrahydrofolate synthase, both synthase and reductases actually need a substrate, which is provided by the NADH. So what you're doing in this case is actually providing the ability to extract more folate from dietary folate sources, for example, like greens, without having to supplement folate necessarily. And in a case that you've got a B12 deficiency, I wouldn't even supplement L-methylfolate at that point before the B12 deficiency is resolved, just because of the information that I was presenting here. So when there's been a state of saturation in the receptors for folate in the gut lumen, and those receptors are saturated, there's going to be a certain amount of inability to metabolize that folic acid, whether it's synthetic folic acid or folate provided in L-methylfolate form, and to actually make use of it. So you're best providing a substrate for its metabolism. So you've got that going on and supporting the activity of the enzymes that allow for the conversion of synthetic folic acid and dehydrofolate to tetrahydrofolate and so on, all the way down the pathway to L-methylfolate, as opposed to provide the L-methylfolate yourself, which may actually block further that those receptors. That seems to be the situation at the moment, given the presentation and the lack of energy and the foggy thinking and so on. So does that make sense? So there is also the fact that when you actually provide B12 in large doses and you replace those levels that may have been deficient, there's going to be a certain repair mechanism of this cognitive impairment that may be temporary, but that is going to affect those individuals, like Gabrielle, who was saying foggy thinking. So again, even though it's never going to be a straight line, and you can never, I would never advise anybody to use any nutrients in this kind of a green allopathic way. So if your thinking is foggy, take a high amount of vitamin B12, and that is kind of it's almost like a tablet for an ill. I would never do that. I would always try and support the processes, metabolic processes, like we've done with the NADH and the B12 working together, as opposed to just one thing for a condition, which is, again, I call it green allopathy. It's never going to be a really good solution for a long-term problem. So, okay, so I'm going to move on to the next case, and then open to questions. So this is Tracy, and this is funny because I've got some Tracys who all know each other, and there are three of them actually, and they all are high flyers that know each other from this networking organization that they all belong to. And they share quite a lot of the similarities. So they're funny, my funny traces, which are very lovely. So this is Tracy, stressed out high flyer, who actually doesn't acknowledge that she's stressed out. She's a very mind over matter kind of person. She's mainly worried about aging prematurely, but she has had breast cancer. In fact, it's come back, and then spread to the bone. Has had successful radiotherapy and chemotherapy. She's had one mammoplasty, and she's now in remission. She doesn't discuss the cancer very much. She is worried about aging prematurely. She's actually looking really good. She doesn't look anything like this lady in here, which is just a lady from the internet. But she travels a lot. She's very high-flying VP of a well-known company, and her life is her business. She's always on call, kind of thing. She's one of these people who is permanently attached to her BlackBerry. So and she travels a lot across time zones. So that's your kind of picture of Tracy. Before I talk about stress and how I tackle stress with Tracy, she's also quite interested in mindfulness. So I've kind of gone via the mindfulness way with her, just by very simple breathing exercises. And in fact, I shared some of the articles that I'm going to show you today with her, because she's actually quite a clever lady. So even though these papers are kind of a little bit too complicated for just the general public, she can actually pick up quite a few of the gems that are shared. I'm sharing with you one of my favorite scientists in stress science. Her name is Elisa Epel from University of San Francisco in California. And she's written quite a few papers on very interesting subjects like telomere length and the effect of mindfulness and meditation on telomere length, the effect of good stress and bad stress on oxidative stress and cortisol reactivity, the effects of cortisol on different tissues. She's written quite a lot on telomeres, so the relationship between high cortisol and telomere length, the relationship between stress, as in psychosocial stress, and inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 and IL-1 and so on. So very interesting stuff. If you've got the time to do some research and to accumulate some papers that are actually quite useful for anybody who turns up with stress, and if you're doing testing, if you're checking oxidative stress, if you see a correlation, these papers can actually provide some valuable gems in there for you in terms of interventions and so on. So I've shared that with you. This is from ResearchGate, this screenshot, and this is just from PubMed. So if you type that in PubMed, you'll get all of the papers, over 154. This is from a couple of weeks, this screenshot, so a little bit more than that now. Very interesting stuff. And she basically says psychosocial stress equals oxidative stress. And she's done a number of different studies that kind of reflect that. She talks about oxidative stress by referring to certain biomarkers like lipid peroxidation, for example, and 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, which is a marker of DNA damage. So when DNA and RNA are actually damaged, what this is going to mean is genomic instability. So if your genome becomes unstable, excuse me, you're going to have a higher chance of developing a chronic disease or autoimmunity and these kind of things that we don't want to get. So that is an important marker of how your genome is actually preserved. And lipid peroxidation can be measured in urine as well as in blood, and it gives you an understanding as well as to how oxidative that person is. There are other related and quite easily accessible markers of oxidation, like the glycated hemoglobin that I showed you before, which are not directly excuse me, telling you about oxidation like these are, which are direct markers of oxidation, but because glycation implies that sugars are binding with proteins, and in that process, there's a certain generation of free radicals. By you're actually implying that that process is oxidative, and taking that marker as an approximation of oxidation. If somebody's got really high glycated hemoglobin, like diabetics, for example, it is known that diabetics are actually suffering from higher levels of oxidation than non-diabetics. So that's the kind of implication here. So this is a really good paper. I've got a couple of screenshots for you just to illustrate the case of Tracy. And this is from a study where they basically looked at two groups, one with chronic stress and another one with low to moderate stress. And they basically measured the amounts of cortisol in both groups based on what is called anticipatory cortisol reactivity, so levels of anxiety, really, to the layman, and they basically concluded that those individuals who are most susceptible to stress even before it happens, so those who react immediately with high cortisol production to stressful situations. And there is this model which is called a TRIA stress eliciting model, which is basically they put you in a room and they give you a fright, they put you under loads of stressful situations, they make you complete tests in record times, and they basically make you sweat, they make you really fear the experience, and they measure different things like cortisol and oxidation and so on before and after. So the thick line is high amounts, the dotted line is lower amounts, and you can see that the oxidative damage is actually lower based on cortisol levels than on the chronic stress group, basically. So this is a really good paper if you want to read it. So Tracy is extremely busy and she travels a lot. So she can only take, she's very avid for knowledge and she'll listen to you talking for 2 hours, but then in reality, having worked with her for a while, she will only take one gem at a time, and she'll implement just a few of the things that you've told her. So I couldn't just give her a whole list of things to do, because she'll only do whatever she can do during that month, and then come back and do a little bit more and so on. But she really liked these guidelines that BANT has at the moment, and I showed her the ETA Rainbow, and she really liked it because obviously there is kind of a cancer protection in there, anti-inflammation. She knows about inflammatory markers and immunity and cells, and having gone through chemotherapy and radiotherapy. So she's not an expert, but she's obviously heard a lot in the ward being there treated. So she quite fancied choosing a few of these things, knowing that she's actually putting some anti-cancer protection in her body. So that was the deal, that she was actually going to increase some of the foods more on the vegetable front than the fruit front, so more on the leafy green front than on the fruits like apples and strawberries. And then there's going to she was actually going to do that for a couple of months and then come to see me. And she also went home with some supplement recommendations that I'm going to show you now. There's a question. Could you let us know your name? Who you asked that question? It's about chronic psychosocial. It's Sue. Hi, Sue. So chronic psychosocial stress and chronic infection. So yes, definitely. So psychosocial stress, the process is that it will push cortisol levels up. When you secrete more cortisol levels, you are inhibiting your immune system, so it leaves you more open to infections. So definitely that is a very clear um, cause-effect kind of relationship. So that's very clear. Yeah, it gets a little bit more complicated because chronic cortisol production, chronic high cortisol, actually messes up with your pro-inflammatory cytokines, and it can get you stuck in an acute phase where IL-1 and IL-6 and TNF-alpha are actually very high, and they shouldn't be like that all the time, but they become chronic as opposed to acute, and that has problems in itself because you become almost immune to that kind of early inflammatory response, which then leaves you open to more problems, to more important problems. Okay, so what Apple is saying, and this is from the same paper, is that we've got a bit of a J curve when it comes to stress, and we actually do better on moderate stress than we do on low stress or high stress. So on low stress, you can actually have a situation where under-arousal and actually leads to little counter-regulation. So your own regulatory systems in your body, which are actually pushing for balance, so your homeostasis systems, your allostasis systems are actually not elicited enough, and that pushing them a little with eustress actually turns into enhanced resilience, which is what happens when you actually feel that you're on your toes, but you can manage. You've got that kind of push that you have a deadline, or that you've got a busy day, but you know you're not completely stressed out and thinking, oh my God, I'm going to panic and break down. So that's high stress, which is the worst potential situation, because chronic hyperarousal leads to high reactive oxygen species and little counter-regulation. So basically, it leaves you open to more oxidative and nitrative stress, which is going to be turning into markers that we can actually measure. So this is basically Tracy's readings from oxidative stress markers, looking at glutathione, lipid peroxides, 8-OHDG, and coenzyme Q10 in plasma. And you can see how she's obviously suffering from a fair amount of oxidation. So it is really true in this case what Apple is saying about psychosocial stress turning into oxidative stress. And in terms of the lipid peroxides, they actually are a marker of damage to the membranes. So if you want to look at cells, for example, when you're looking at these tables, lipid peroxides will give you an indication of damage to membranes, as opposed to the 8-OHDG, which is damage to RNA and DNA. So you're looking at deeper damage to the nucleus of the cell. So lipid peroxides, whether they are in urine or in blood, you'll see them in urine and in blood in different studies. They're a marker of cell membrane damage. Now, serine actually is a really interesting nutrient because you use it to modulate the fluidity of cell membranes, which sometimes can be a problem because if they are too rigid, they can actually break, basically. And if they are too fluid, there's going to be problems with allostasis. There's going to be too much osmosis going on. There's going to be too much exchange of fluids between the inside and the outside of the cell, which can itself be a problem. So, and coenzyme Q10 is a good protector of genomic stability, and in this case, it's kind of just borderline low in a case where the other ones are actually so low, and we've got a situation with deficiency in vitamin D is not ideal. So just because of these markers, so lipid peroxides kind of high and damage to DNA. There's damage potentially to the genome in general due to low coenzyme Q10, lack of energy potentially in the longer run due to coenzyme Q10, which is needed for mitochondrial health, and very low vitamin D. These are, in a way, coupled very nicely with some of Tracy's genetic characteristics, which are a negative variation in one of the vitamin D receptor genes. So there are different genes for vitamin D receptors, but this is one of them. So we've got a situation where Tracy is likely to need more vitamin D than average. She also have a negative variation for superoxide dismutase, and one of the glutathione genes is absent, so it's deleted. You see, glutathione genes actually don't have SNPs; they're either there or not. And the M1 is actually absent. So in general, taking into account this kind of conglomerate of nutrients that and molecules that protect you from environmental insults and oxidative stress, like vitamin D, superoxide dismutase, and glutathione, she's not very well equipped to deal with oxidative stress, which may be why she's actually got that kind of oxidative picture that she has. She's early 50s, so I think 53. So again, it's the kind of age where if something's going to crack, it starts cracking. So so I always give people a note of caution with genetics. I love nutrigenetics. I think it's a fantastic tool. I love having data from people if I can have it. If they are not keen, or if it's a bit too onerous for them in terms of like thinking that it's destiny, I always try and remind them that it's not destiny, that it's the epigenetic environment that is actually modulating what they become in the end. But you know, if you have the information, it's actually excellent. If you don't have it, you can always get by with functional, but it does help having the genetics. I just don't want people to get obsessed with nutrigenetics, because sometimes it's the relationships between the genes, which we don't really know enough about, that may be a lot more important than the individual SNPs. And I see a lot of this treating the SNP kind of thing and giving just one supplement for each of the SNPs and so on, which terrifies me. So so that's my point of view on genetic data and nutrigenetics. Never really treat the SNP at all. Go with the relationships and put it in context as well with the person. So Tracy may be stuck in this inflammatory response that I was telling you about, which is the inflammatory phase, is the initial phase. This is from a paper on skin health, actually, on neuroimmunomodulation of the skin as a tissue. And it's actually very faint, so I'm not sure whether you can see it properly. It's actually very faint in the paper itself, so I couldn't get a better copy of it, but you can actually get it in the paper. And it's talking about how certain cytokines are actually released during the initial inflammatory phase, where you form a clot, and there's a neutrophil accumulation and macrophage activation and so on. And with chronic stress, you can actually get stuck in that inflammatory phase. So you almost become immune to these inflammatory markers that don't allow you to go on to the next phase, which is the proliferative phase, and onto the remodeling phase. So this is from skin. So somebody worried about skin health, if they are stressed to their eyeballs, they are never going to have a glowing kind of wrinkle-free skin, because they are going into a catabolic state where increased inflammation and increased cortisol levels mean that they're going to be self-digesting because of the cortisol, and highly damaged by oxidation from exposure to those increased inflammatory markers that they have become almost immune to. So, okay, so this is the kind of thing that I agreed with Tracy. Again, I've simplified this, just because of time and just just really going through the key of the intervention. So increased antioxidants from vegetables, particularly. So the Eat Rainbow handout that she really loved, she's been quite inspired with. And I created my own version as well with more examples. So I shared that with her as well, and she really likes that. And then I actually went with coenzyme Q10 and NADH and serine and vitamin C, which again, it kind of like when I was choosing the cases for this presentation, this was the perfect one to choose Reconnect for, just because of the combination of different nutrients, just because of the actual picture and those markers that are measured in that test. So I've gone with 4 tablets, which was what was actually used in the recent randomized controlled trial on Reconnect. But I've done that for a month and then down to 1 and 1. So the normal dose that you get in the box is just 1 and 1, or 2 tablets at once if you want it, but 2 tablets a day. And I went with double as that just because of the urgency of the situation. And I also did a sublingual D3 and K2 spray, which is good health naturally. So didn't put that in there, but just that's the brand. And a liposomal glutathione that Tracy had actually bought in the States, and she wanted to know whether she could continue with that because somebody recommended it for the cancer when she was going to go into chemotherapy as an adjuvant. And I said, if you've got a week left and you want to use it, that's absolutely fine. So I'm not sure how strong that would have been. I like liposomal glutathione, but it's more an intuitive feeling than actually knowing that it works very well. To be quite honest, I think it's one of those that is tricky to absorb. So, but I have seen people actually react quite well to liposomal glutathione. So, and that was indicated because of the case as well. So that's kind of the improved markers. So this is 2 months later, and she has still got problems with the vitamin D. So she's barely in the green, but she is just barely in the green, basically. So she should really be more than that, especially if she wants protection and not just basically be classed as being okay by the government, basically. So what is significant is that the damage to DNA RNA as marked by 8-OHDG, the adenosine marker, has decreased, even though it's still suboptimal. For me, it's actually quite good because it's gone down from something like 21 to 12. And the lipid peroxides have actually gone down. Again, they're still borderline, so they're still, if you can see, just about in the yellow, but that is, again, another achievement, really, in terms of what we've done together. And coenzyme Q10 seems to have been absorbed nicely as well. So it's gone to 1.11. And I think I've got the previous one. I'll show it to you in a second. But one of the reasons why as well I chose NADH, one of the molecules that are part of Reconnect to give to Tracy is because of lipid peroxidation. So in a recent randomized controlled trial on the use of NADH and coenzyme Q10 for a month on chronic fatigue patients, lipid peroxidation was measured before and after, and compared to a control group, so a fully placebo double-blind controlled trial, and it was found that on 20 milligrams a day for a month, lipid peroxidation was actually much lower. So that is that's actually one of the reasons why I thought to go with NADH as one of those antioxidant signaling molecules that can help you with that. So, yeah, so I'm quite happy with that progression. What was there as well as a bit of a bonus is the fact that the homocysteine had actually responded, again, marginally, but better nonetheless. And this is what I was telling you before. Different labs will give you different ranges, but normally, if you go with Genova, the range is anything more than 10.40 will be suboptimal or outside range, and more than 15 is to worry about, as opposed to if you go to a lab like the doctor's laboratory, for example, they will tell you that it's 15 what you need to worry about. So they've got a slightly different range or interpretation measure. But in this case, it's a slight modification in a slight decrease in homocysteine levels, which may well be because homocysteine is actually an oxidative molecule. So it's known to auto-oxidate. Now, when you stop the auto-oxidation by putting in an antioxidant molecule like NADH, coenzyme Q10, serine to a certain extent, and vitamin C, what you're doing is bringing down the oxidation systemically, so that has a knock-on effect on homocysteine level. It stops the auto-oxidation, which to a certain extent impedes the levels going higher. So I put that in there, and I don't remember why. It will come to me in a second. Yeah, I think it will do with homocysteine levels. Yeah, so again, okay, yeah, I remember now. So just to remind you about how certain molecules, again, without actually providing the substrate, like the L-methylfolate that is needed to reduce homocysteine, if you actually provide the substrate, that substrate needs to be created in the first place, which is an enabler of an enzyme, like those enzymes here, which is NADH. What you're doing is favoring your own metabolism of folic acid, which we could have actually have even a screenshot of Tracy's folic acid, which was in high need. I do remember that, definitely from the NutriEval. But what I know is that her homocysteine has actually decreased. So there's in here just a relationship between levels of L-methylfolate or the bioactive folate and homocysteine, as well as blood pressure, which is always going to be a good idea if somebody's really stressed out and they've got a history of high blood pressure. So I think yeah, so I think I've come to the end of the presentation. So have you any questions? Before questions, I wanted to thank our sponsor for the presentation today, which is Vitae. And some of you will have been using Reconnect, which is just shown here as a formula containing NADH, coenzyme Q10, vitamin C and serine. But Vitae is actually available via the Natural Dispensary and the Nutri-Center, and it's bringing some of the other products that it has in Spain, where it has been marketed for the last 20 years in various establishments, including pharmacies, and it's a very well-known and respected brand. So you'll see more products coming up on the Natural Dispensary and the Nutri-Center in the coming months. So yeah, so have you any questions about any of the slides that I've presented today or anything else? There was also, before I go on to questions, there was a question from somebody who may be online still about intravenous supplementation of NADH. And there is some evidence that NADH can be injected intravenously. It has been used in certain protocols for Parkinson's disease. again, on the basis that it is a molecule that favors the decrease of free radical formation in the brain, and that's one of the contributory factors to the development of later stages of Parkinson's disease. So, so it works on that basis, but I haven't got first-hand experience as I'm not working with intravenous nutrients. Any other questions for me about anything at all? No questions from anyone? Okay, well, if you haven't any questions, then I'll say thank you to all of you who stayed until the end, and I'll be sharing the presentation during the day today, and it will have links to all of the papers that I've shared with you, and thank you very much for your time. Apologies for the slight technical hitch in the beginning with the sound. And if you've managed to go and listen to the recording, again, thank you for your patience. So thank you to everybody again, and I will see you again very soon. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.